Hey guys, welcome back to this channel, The Voice of the Past. In this video, we will unfold the untold story of the Callahan family's disappearing act, The Vanished Estate. Before continuing, if you are new into this channel, please consider subscribing to this channel. Let's start. The Callahan Estate had stood for over a century, an architectural marvel nestled deep within the rolling hills of Ridgewood. Built in 1887 by Jonathan Callahan, a railroad tycoon, the mansion had been the family's legacy. A towering Gothic structure with sprawling grounds, intricate stonework, and windows that gleamed like darkened eyes in the night. It was a house of grandeur and secrets, a place whispered about in town as much for its beauty as for the unsettling aura it carried. But on the morning of November 3rd, 1982, something unthinkable happened. The entire estate, every brick, every window, every piece of furniture, vanished overnight, and so did the Callahan family. A vanishing unlike any other. It wasn't a fire. There were no ashes, no rubble, no signs of demolition. One day it was there, looming over the town like a silent sentinel, and the next day, nothing. Just an expanse of untouched earth where it had once stood. The perfectly manicured lawn was now an empty field, as though nothing had ever been built there. The people of Ridgewood were stunned. How could a mansion that size disappear without a trace? Some thought it had been a cruel prank, an illusion orchestrated by some twisted genius. Others whispered about supernatural forces, dark magic, or even extraterrestrial involvement. But none of those explanations accounted for the most chilling part of the mystery. The Callahan family was gone too. The investigation begins. Sheriff Daniel Grayson had never encountered anything like it in his 20 years on the force. He stood where the front doors of the Callahan mansion should have been, his boots sinking into the damp grass. There was nothing, no basement, no foundation, no sign that a house had ever been there. "How the hell does a building just disappear?" he muttered, squatting down to touch the soil. It wasn't disturbed, no signs of excavation. It was as if the house had never existed. And yet, there were records. The Callahan estate had been listed on property tax reports for decades. The family was known, seen, spoken to, just the night before at a charity gala. Witnesses swore they had been alive and well, chatting, laughing, sipping wine. And yet by dawn, every single one of them, Jonathan Callahan III, his wife Eleanor, their children Benjamin and Claire, their butler, their housekeeper, all gone. No footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of struggle. A search party combed the surrounding woods for miles. Bloodhounds were brought in but found nothing. The Callahans' cars were still in town, parked outside the gala venue. Their bank accounts remained untouched. It was as if they had simply faded into thin air. The curse of the Callahans. As the search continued, old rumors resurfaced, whispers of a curse that had plagued the Callahan family for generations. An elderly woman named Margaret Delacroix, one of the last surviving members of Ridgewood's founding families, insisted she had seen this before. "It's happened before," she told Sheriff Grayson in a voice barely above a whisper. "Not all at once, not like this. But one by one, the Callahans have been disappearing for over a century, ever since the house was built." Grayson leaned in. Disappearing how? Margaret's frail hands shook as she clutched her rosary. Jonathan Callahan built that house on land that wasn't his to take. He ignored the warnings. He thought his wealth made him untouchable. "What warnings?" "The land," she whispered. "It belonged to something else before the Callahans. Something old, something hungry." A journal of secrets intrigued, Grayson searched town archives for any records of the original construction of the estate. What he found was disturbing. The blueprints were missing. The official deed to the land was gone from the courthouse. Even photographs of the mansion seemed to have disappeared from historical records, leaving nothing but blurred or missing pages where the house should have been. Then he found the journal. Buried deep in the town's library archives, an old leather-bound book bore the name Elias Callahan, 1902. Elias was Jonathan Callahan's son, a reclusive man who rarely left the estate. The journal was brittle with age, its ink faded but still legible. As Grayson read through it, his pulse quickened. The entries spoke of strange occurrences, whispers in the walls, footsteps in the halls at night, shadows moving in the corners of rooms where no one stood. Elias wrote of his growing fear that the house was never really theirs, that something beneath it stirred when the lights went out. The final entry, written in shaking hands, read, "The house is not ours to keep. It belongs to the ones beneath, and when the time comes, it will leave with them." Grayson shut the journal, his breath uneven. Had the Callahans uncovered something they weren't meant to? And if so, where had they gone? Echoes in the night. That night, standing at the edge of the empty field where the estate once stood, Grayson felt an unshakable presence. The wind howled through the trees, but beneath it, something else moved. A whisper. Software, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A voice calling from beyond. A voice whispering the name. Callahan. Sheriff Daniel Grayson barely slept that night. The journal's final words haunted him, echoing in his mind like a warning. It belongs to the ones beneath, and when the time comes, it will leave with them. Had that time finally come? By morning, the town was in chaos. News of the Callahan family's disappearance had spread far beyond Ridgewood. Reporters from neighboring towns arrived, eager to uncover the truth behind the estate's vanishing. Theories ranged from government conspiracies to mass hallucination. Some believed the Callahans had staged the entire event, retreating into hiding for reasons unknown. But Grayson knew better. Something unnatural had happened here. The house that wasn't there. Determined to find answers, Grayson met with Dr. Eleanor Vance, a local historian who specialized in Ridgewood's past. If anyone knew the truth about the land beneath the Callahan estate, it would be her. Seated across from him in her dimly lit study, Eleanor flipped through an ancient town ledger, its pages yellowed with age. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. Grayson leaned forward. "What doesn't?" Eleanor tapped her finger against the page. "There are no records of any construction on that land prior to 1887, when Jonathan Callahan built his mansion. But that's impossible. Why?" She hesitated. "Because Ridgewood's earliest settlers refused to live there. The area was considered cursed, even before Callahan." Grayson's skin prickled. "Cursed?" Eleanor nodded, pushing another book toward him. It was an old surveyor's map from the 1700s, long before Ridgewood was officially founded. The land where the Callahan estate should have been was marked with a single word: forbidden. "There were reports from the first settlers," she continued. "Accounts of people going missing, of entire families vanishing. They called it the Hollow, a place where reality itself was unstable." "Unstable?" Eleanor sighed. "Like something beneath the land could pull things out of existence." Grayson's grip on the book tightened. It sounded absurd, but after what he had seen, he couldn't dismiss it. Then Eleanor flipped to another page, one that sent a chill down his spine. It was a sketch, a crude drawing faded with age, depicting what appeared to be a house that looked exactly like the Callahan estate, a house that shouldn't exist. Grayson stared at the drawing. This is impossible," Eleanor nodded. "It was drawn in 1736, 150 years before Jonathan Callahan built his mansion." Grayson swallowed. You're saying this house has been appearing and disappearing for centuries? That's what the records suggest. She hesitated. Or worse, maybe it was never meant to be here in the first place. The words hung heavy between them. The Callahan legacy. That night, Grayson returned to his office, exhausted but unwilling to let the case go cold. He combed through every available record of the Callahan family, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. That's when he found it. A faded newspaper clipping from 1921. Local heir to Callahan Estate, found wandering the woods, claims the house disappeared. The article told the story of Edwin Callahan, who had been the sole survivor when his family mysteriously vanished one evening. He was found days later, delirious, repeating the same thing over and over. The house is gone. It's gone. They took it back. No one had believed him. He had been institutionalized in a sanitarium until his death in 1943. Grayson clenched his fists. This had happened before. The Callahans had always disappeared. But why? And who had taken them? A whisper in the dark. As he locked up for the night, Grayson heard something. A soft whisper just outside his window. He turned sharply. The office overlooked the now empty land where the Callahan estate had once stood. But something was different. There were footprints in the grass, leading away from the field, and vanishing into the woods. Grayson's heart pounded. Someone, or something, was still out there, and he was going to find them. Sheriff Daniel Grayson stood frozen, staring at the footprints leading into the dense forest. The night air was still, yet something in the shadows moved, something he couldn't see, but could feel. He knew he should call for backup, knew that following these tracks alone was reckless. But deep down, an instinct gnawed at him. This was his chance to find out what really happened to the Callahans. Hand resting on the holster of his revolver, he stepped forward. The woods swallowed him whole. The path of no return. The deeper Grayson ventured, the darker it became. The trees were thick, ancient, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. His flashlight cut through the darkness, but it felt weak against the overwhelming blackness pressing in around him. The footprints led straight ahead. Crunch. A sound behind him. He spun around, gun drawn, but there was nothing, just the empty trail, vanishing into the night. Something was wrong here. The woods felt unnatural. The air was heavy, thick with an eerie stillness. The more he walked, the more a strange sensation crawled up his spine. It felt like he was being watched. Then he heard it. A whisper, faint, distant, drifting through the trees. Grayson. His blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Eleanor Vance. But Eleanor was back in town. She wasn't here. He raised his flashlight, scanning the trees. Eleanor? No answer. Just silence. He took another step, and the ground gave way beneath him. The hollow Grayson tumbled down a steep incline, his flashlight spinning wildly before slamming against a rock and flickering out. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. For a moment, he lay there dazed. Then he heard it again. Grayson. He forced himself to sit up, his breath ragged. The forest around him was different. The trees here were wrong. Their bark was blackened, their roots twisted in unnatural patterns. The air smelled stale, like something ancient and undisturbed. His flashlight was shattered. He fumbled for his lighter, flicking it on. The small flame barely illuminated the space around him, but it was enough. The footprints continued, and just ahead, something loomed in the darkness. A structure. No, a house. The house that shouldn't be. Grayson's breath caught in his throat. It was the Callahan Estate, standing there, deep in the forest, as if it had never disappeared. Its towering Gothic frame was untouched by time, its windows dark and lifeless. The front doors stood slightly ajar, as if inviting him inside. This was impossible. He stepped closer, and as he did, something moved in one of the windows. A flicker of motion, a silhouette. Someone, or something, was inside. Swallowing his fear, he drew his revolver and stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under his weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. He pushed the door open wider. Darkness swallowed him whole. Echoes of the past. The air inside was thick, stale, carrying the scent of dust and something metallic. Blood. His pulse pounded in his ears as he stepped forward. The grand foyer was exactly as he remembered from old photographs. Ornate chandeliers, intricate marble flooring, a grand staircase leading to the second floor. Except everything was frozen in time. Cobwebs stretched across the furniture, dust coated every surface. It was as if the house had been abandoned for decades, yet it had disappeared only 2 nights ago. Grayson moved deeper inside, his every step slow, deliberate. Then he heard it, a soft sobbing from upstairs. He aimed his gun toward the staircase. "Sheriff Grayson, if anyone's here, come out now." No response, just the quiet sound of weeping. It was coming from the master bedroom. His hands were slick with sweat as he reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with portraits of the Callahan ancestors, their faces watching him with hollow, empty eyes. The sobbing grew louder. It was coming from behind a door at the end of the hall. He reached for the doorknob, and the moment his fingers touched it, the crying stopped. Silence. Heavy. Overwhelming. Then, a whisper, right against his ear. "They see you now." The forgotten room. Grayson whipped around, gun raised, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. His breath was ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. He should leave. He should run. But something in him wouldn't. He turned back to the door and pushed it open. The room was empty. Dust-covered furniture, a large 4-poster bed, draped curtains swaying slightly as if disturbed by an unseen breeze. No one was here, except in the center of the room stood a chair, and on that chair sat a single open book, a journal. Grayson stepped closer, recognizing the name on the worn leather cover. Eleanor Callahan. The last entry was scrawled in hurried handwriting, the ink smudged, as if written in panic. "The house is not ours. It never was. They took us because we saw too much. If you're reading this, it means you're next." Grayson's breath hitched. Then, a creak, the sound of a footstep behind him. He turned, and the last thing he saw were the shadows closing in. Sheriff Daniel Grayson's vision blurred as the shadows closed in. A suffocating darkness wrapped around him, thick like smoke, but alive, moving, whispering, pulling. He tried to raise his gun, but his limbs wouldn't obey. The journal in his hand felt impossibly heavy. The words burned into his mind. "If you are reading this, it means you are next." Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the darkness recoiled. Grayson collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The room was silent again, but something had changed. The air felt wrong, like he was no longer alone. Slowly, he lifted his gaze toward the doorway, and there, standing in the hall, was a figure, the woman in the dark. She was barely visible in the dim light, a frail silhouette in a tattered white nightgown. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her face, her arms limp at her sides. Grayson's throat tightened. Who are you?" The woman tilted her head. Then she took a step forward. The boards beneath her feet didn't creak. She wasn't walking. She was gliding. Grayson's heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet. He backed away, his fingers tightening around his gun. "Stay back!" The woman stopped. A long, uneasy silence stretched between them. Then she lifted her head slightly. and for the first time Grayson saw her face, or rather, what was left of it. The skin was hollow, stretched thin over sharp bones. Her eyes were sunken, dark, as if they had been gouged out and replaced with shadows. Then she opened her mouth, and Grayson heard the voices, echoes of the "taken." The sound wasn't human. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a whisper. It was hundreds of voices speaking at once, some begging, some sobbing, some laughing. But one voice cut through them all, a child's voice. "Help us." Grayson fired his gun. The shot rang through the house, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer. Grayson turned and ran. The descent. The hallway stretched. Each step felt longer, slower, as if something was pulling him backward. The house was changing around him, the walls moving, shifting, breathing. He threw open a door and found himself standing in a basement. That wasn't possible. The Callahan mansion had no basement, yet here it was, a cold, cavernous space, the stone walls lined with ancient carvings, symbols he didn't recognize, shapes that seemed to move when he looked at them. And in the center of the room, a staircase leading down into the earth. Grayson's pulse thundered. The voices were louder now, the child's voice clearer. "Please, hurry!" Gritting his teeth, Grayson gripped his flashlight and stepped forward, down into the dark, the ones beneath. The air grew colder the deeper he went. The steps spiraled downward, rough stone beneath his hands, the air damp and heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Then, suddenly, he reached the bottom, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The space was massive, a cavern stretching far beyond the limits of the mansion. A massive stone altar sat in the center, covered in deep gashes, claw marks, and surrounding it, the Callahan family. They stood motionless, their faces blank, their eyes black pits of nothingness. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, like something had drained the life from them. Grayson staggered forward. "Jonathan? Eleanor?" No response. Then he saw the child, Claire Callahan. She was kneeling at the altar, trembling, her lips moving soundlessly. Grayson rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her. Claire, look at me." Her eyes flickered, just for a second, back to normal. Then, the shadows rose from the ground. Grayson's breath caught as the darkness took shape. Tall, too tall, arms too long, fingers too sharp, no eyes, no mouth, just a gaping, endless void. The thing loomed over the altar, its form shifting, twisting, hungry. And then, it spoke. "You are not supposed to be here." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was inside his head. Grayson gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on Claire's arm. "You took them. We claimed what was promised." The shadows reached for him. Claire screamed. Grayson raised his gun, fired. The shadows didn't stop. The cavern shook, the walls cracking, crumbling. The altar began to sink. Grayson acted on instinct. He grabbed Claire and ran. Escape. The world collapsed around him. The stone walls splintered, the ground cracked open as the shadows roared, reaching, stretching, but not fast enough. Grayson reached the staircase, hauling Claire up with him. The child sobbed against his chest, her small hands clutching his jacket. Faster, faster, almost there. With one final leap, Grayson burst through the basement door. And the house was gone. He was back in the woods. The field where the Callahan Estate had once stood was empty. No mansion, no shadows, just the cold wind and the silent night. The last Callahan. Claire clung to him, shaking. Grayson collapsed to his knees, heart pounding. He had saved her. But the others? He looked back at the empty land, his chest tightening. The Callahan mansion had vanished again, and this time It had taken the rest with it. But why had it spared Claire? As she wept in his arms, one thought haunted him. It wasn't over. The house would return. It always did. And next time, it might take them both. Sheriff Daniel Grayson sat in his office, staring at the child across from him. Claire Callahan, 8 years old, the last surviving member of her family. She hadn't spoken since they escaped the mansion's ruins 2 nights ago. She just sat there, silent, her eyes distant, as if part of her was still in that underground abyss. The town was still in chaos. Reporters swarmed Ridgewood, asking questions no one could answer. The Callahan Estate was gone, its land now an empty field once again. No one believed Grayson's story. No one except Eleanor Vance. A mind that remembers. Eleanor sat beside Claire, gently holding the child's hand. "She's traumatized," she murmured. "Whatever she saw, it's still inside her head." Grayson exhaled. "I don't know how to help her." Eleanor glanced at him. "We need to make her remember." Grayson frowned. "She barely survived. If we push her too hard?" Eleanor placed a small notebook on his desk. "She's been drawing." Grayson flipped it open, his stomach twisting. The pages were filled with horrifying sketches, twisted, shadowy figures with empty faces, a black house sinking into the ground, a staircase leading into darkness, and on the last page, a name, etched in shaking, uneven handwriting. Elias Callahan. Grayson felt his blood run cold. "Elias," he whispered. Eleanor nodded. "Claire remembers something about him." "But Elias has been dead for decades." Eleanor's expression was grim. "Or maybe he never left." A visit to the dead. The Ridgewood Cemetery sat on the outskirts of town, a quiet, forgotten place where generations of Callahans were buried. Grayson and Eleanor stood before an old gravestone, its surface cracked and worn. Elias Callahan, 1871? Grayson narrowed his eyes. "There's no death date." Eleanor glanced at him. "Because no one ever found his body." They had dug through old records. Elias Callahan had disappeared in 1902, right after writing the journal that warned of the house's fate. No remains, no explanation, just gone. Just like the Callahan mansion. Grayson stepped closer, his boot sinking slightly into the damp earth. Then, the ground shifted. His stomach lurched as the soil beneath the gravestone caved in. Eleanor gasped, "Grayson, move!" But it was too late. The earth swallowed him whole. Beneath the surface, Grayson's world became darkness and dust. He landed hard, coughing as dirt filled his lungs. Eleanor's voice echoed above, but she sounded far away. He flicked on his flashlight and froze. He wasn't in a grave. He was in a tunnel. A long, winding passage carved into the rock. The walls were lined with symbols, the same ones from the Callahan mansion's basement. The air smelled of damp stone and rot. Something moved in the shadows ahead. Grayson gritted his teeth, raising his flashlight. "Who's there?" No response. Then, a whisper. "Help me." Grayson's pulse spiked. That voice. He knew that voice. He stepped forward. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber, and in the center, a man, or what was left of him. "Elias Callahan lives." The figure was thin, skeletal, draped in tattered clothes. His hair was white, his face hollow, his eyes sunken black voids. Grayson's breath caught. "Elias Callahan?" The man twitched. Then, in a voice like rusted metal, he rasped, "It won't let me die." Grayson's fingers tightened around his gun. "What won't?" Elias's head jerked up. His mouth moved, but another voice spoke through him. "The house." A deep rumbling shook the chamber. The walls shuddered, cracked. The shadows shifted. Grayson realized he wasn't alone. There were other shapes in the darkness. Twisted forms, eyes like burning coals, faces half-formed. The lost Callahans. Elias gasped, his frail body convulsing. It took them. It takes anyone who stays too long. Grayson grabbed him. How do I stop it? Elias's voice was barely a whisper. Burn it. Then the shadows lunged. The escape Grayson fired. The chamber exploded in sound as he grabbed Elias and ran. The tunnel behind him collapsed, the shadows screaming in rage. Somewhere above, Eleanor was shouting his name. He looked up. Light. Grayson leapt upward, grabbing the edge of the pit as Eleanor pulled him free. Elias clawed at the ground, wheezing. He was barely alive. Grayson turned to Eleanor. We have to burn it, she paled. Burn what? The house is gone. Grayson looked back at the grave, his mind racing. Then it hit him. The house isn't just a building, he said. It's alive. Eleanor frowned. What are you saying? He exhaled sharply. The land, the cursed land. That's what's keeping it alive. Elias gasped. His voice was barely a whisper. Destroy the land, and the house will never return. Grayson's heart pounded. It was time to end this. Sheriff Daniel Grayson stood in the moonlit field where the Callahan mansion once stood. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, the soil dark and unnatural. The house was gone, but it wasn't dead. Not yet. Behind him, Eleanor Vance helped Elias Callahan stand, his frail body trembling. The man was more ghost than human, his skin stretched thin over brittle bones. He had survived over 80 years beneath the land, not by choice. The house will return, Elias whispered. It always does. Grayson tightened his grip on his lighter. Not this time, he turned to Eleanor. Are you sure this will work? Eleanor hesitated. If the land is what feeds it, then yes. But if we fail, we won't. Grayson had seen what lived beneath this land, and he would rather burn the entire town to the ground than let it take another soul. Lighting the match. They had gathered every barrel of gasoline Ridgewood had. The townsfolk thought they were insane, but Grayson didn't care. Elias had marked the cursed perimeter, the invisible border where the Callahan Estate had always reappeared. The ground inside that space was wrong, soft, hollow, whispering. Now it was drenched in fuel. Grayson flicked his lighter open. The small flame flickered, struggling against the wind. Eleanor swallowed. Once we do this, there's no turning back. He met her gaze. There never was. Then, he dropped the lighter. Hell rises. The fire erupted instantly. Bright orange flames raced across the field, licking at the air, devouring everything in their path. Then, the screaming began. Not human screams, not animal. Something else, something old. The ground shook violently. The air split apart with an ear-piercing shriek. Elias collapsed, clutching his head. It's waking up, he gasped. It knows. The earth cracked open. A massive chasm split through the center of the burning field, revealing a void of endless blackness. And then, they rose. The shadows fight back. Figures crawled from the abyss, their forms twisted, stretched, writhing. The lost Callahans. Their eyes were black, their mouths moving in silent horror. Their faces were half gone, half swallowed by darkness. And behind them, the thing that had taken them. It was formless, shifting, moving like liquid, like smoke, like something that was never meant to be seen. Grayson grabbed Elias, pulling him away. Run! Eleanor grabbed Claire Callahan, who stood frozen in fear, and dragged her back toward the tree line. The fire raged higher, but the shadows pushed through it. They were resisting. The ground convulsed, the sky darkened. Elias gritted his teeth. It's not enough. It needs more. Grayson's mind raced. Then he saw it. The old well, the one that had always been on the Callahan property. It had been sealed decades ago, forgotten, But if the house was a parasite, then the well was its root. Destroy the root, kill the house. The final strike. Grayson sprinted toward the well. The heat from the flames burned his skin, but he didn't stop. He grabbed a canister of gasoline, ripped it open, and poured it straight down the well's opening. The shadows shrieked. The ground buckled beneath him. The void pulled at him, like invisible hands trying to drag him under. And then he lit a match. He stared into the abyss one last time and dropped it. The end of the house. The explosion ripped through the field. A massive column of fire shot into the sky, swallowing the well, the cursed land, and the thing that lurked beneath. The just shadows screamed, long, piercing, inhuman. The Callahan ghosts withered, their blackened eyes fading, their forms collapsing into dust. The void began to collapse in on itself. And then, silence. The fire burned until sunrise. By morning, the land was nothing but ash and scorched earth. The house is gone. For the first time in centuries, the Callahan mansion did not return. The land was still, empty. The curse, finally broken. Elias Callahan lay on the ground, weak but smiling. "It's over," he whispered. "It's finally over." Grayson collapsed beside him, staring at the sky. Claire Callahan, the last Callahan, held Eleanor's hand tightly, silent but safe. They had won. For the first time in over 100 years, Ridgewood was free, and the Callahan estate would never return. Epilogue. The Vanished Estate. 1 year later, the land where the Callahan estate once stood remained empty. No one dared build on it. No one even walked near it. Grayson sat in his car, staring at the barren field. The town had moved on, but he hadn't. Eleanor had left Ridgewood, taking Claire with her. The child had barely spoken since that night, but at least she was alive. Elias had passed away a month later, peacefully. His body had finally given up. As if, now that the house was gone, he was finally allowed to rest. And Grayson? Some nights he still heard the whispers, but they were fading. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. The Callahan estate had vanished, and this time, it wasn't coming back. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories like this, hit that like button and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And let me know on which topic you would like to see stories next. And check out these other stories you might enjoy. See you in the next one. Till then, take care and goodbye.